All right, good morning, or good afternoon, everyone. It's a Zoom time, so I'm losing track of my day. I want to welcome you to our summer series presented by the Montana Renewable Energy Association. My name is Evora Glenn. I'm the research intern here at MREA. Before we begin, I would also like to recognize our sponsors. So Clearwater Credit Union, Kaufman Engineers, the Montana Energy Office, On-Site Energy, Arrow, and Forward Montana Foundation. So, as I said, we're the Montana Renewable Energy Association. We're speaking of Montana powered by the sun, wind, and earth, and MREA is a hub for renewable energy education and advocacy in Montana. So, we're very excited today to be joined by Stacie Peterson, with the National Center for Appropriate Technology. I will let her introduce herself, but thank you so much for joining us, Stacie. I'm going to unmute you now and then pass the presentation to you.
So I'm Stacie Peterson. Thanks a lot for the introduction, Evora. And I am the Energy Program Director at the National Center for Appropriate Technology. We're a national nonprofit that works in sustainable ag and sustainable agriculture, and sustainable energy. And so we're very interested in agrivoltaics, which is what I'm here to talk to you about today. So a brief overview of what I'll talk about today. I'll go over first what the concept of agrivoltaics is, then a little background on why they are great, and then talk about some applications, and then talk about the Agri-Solar Clearinghouse, which NCAT is working on developing. And then I'll provide a list of resources that you can click on. If you want a copy of this presentation, just shoot me an email and I'll send it your way. And then we'll open it up for some questions. So agrivoltaics is a term used to describe the co-location of solar and agricultural operations. They can be directly over or surrounding and adjacent to the agricultural operations. It can be a farm or a ranch. It can also be pollinator strips or pollinator areas. Buffer lands work great for this, conservation lands, and then processing operations and farm worker spaces are also great places to co-locate solar and ag. Bit of a background on this. This picture shows a large-scale solar development, and often what happens in these big solar developments is they go through and they grade the land, and they do this just so they can have a good efficient use of the space for the solar development. But in doing that, they're removing all of the habitat and they're removing the pollinator spaces, and they're often replacing agricultural lands or residential lands. And when I look at this picture, I see this huge potential for synergy. You see a blank canvas around the solar panels. There's places that we could be putting pollinators or beehives, or we could be growing crops, we could be grazing animals, things like that. So there's this huge potential there for a synergistic use of space. As a part of that, there's a pushback right now that's going on. These articles are just showing some of the pushback of people that are going against large solar developments, particularly in agricultural areas. They see it as a competitive use of space. And they're pushing back, especially in areas where they've got a real bucolic landscape. They don't want to see these big industrial looking solar farms. And so agrivoltaic goes to try to answer this, to show that it's not going to compete against the agricultural space, it's going to be part of it. So some more benefits beyond that, there's a diversified revenue stream that can occur because of agrivoltaics. In addition to your crops or in addition to your livestock, you can also earn money from a solar developer that might lease land from you, or you can generate the power yourself. You can reduce your energy costs because of that. There's also additional funding sources when you bring agrivoltaics into play. You can get funding from the USDA for this from an agricultural perspective, or you can get funding from the US Department of Energy is another place you can go. I'll talk a little bit more about that at the end, and then I'll give some links to places that you can look for those. There's also tax and utility incentives, not necessarily in Montana just yet, but there are some nationally. There is an opportunity for habitat preservation There's also a good bit of water conservation that occurs, and so we have some increased soil health. There's a potential for season extension, and there's also a great opportunity for shade. So there could be shade tolerant plants or shade for your workers, lots of good shade underneath those solar panels. And there's the reduced land use competition. And then importantly, maintenance and damage to the panel is decreased when you bring these crops in. If you look at the one in this photo here, we've got a vineyard, and that is greatly decreasing the need for mowing or for dust suppression that might damage the panels. So one example of an application of agrivoltaics is pollinator strips. And these are strips of land underneath or around a solar site. And they're planted with deep-rooted plants and grasses, flowers typically. And they try to use native plants and flowers as much as possible. And these capture and filter the water. They help build topsoil and they increase soil health there, therefore. And then critically, what they're doing is they're bringing more habitat for pollinators, for bees and for butterflies, insects, and birds. And then these pollinators are pollinating the surrounding farms. So it's really beneficial to farming operations. And also, if you look at the picture down on the right, there's a lot of beautification that occurs with the flowers and with the pollinators. And people that are, like there's been larger solar developments that have shown that they're going to do a pollinator strip when they install this, and they're having much more acceptance of the people that live in these areas when they can show that it's a beautiful installation that they're doing as opposed to a decimated landscape like I showed a couple slides ago. So another pollinator option is beekeeping. This is an example of a solar apiary in Medford, Oregon, and it was installed by Pine Gate Renewables. There's 48 beehives there, and then they've planted pollinators all around and under the solar development. And it's pollinating nearby farms to great success. Farming is a great place to co-locate solar and ag. You can grow shade tolerant crops underneath the panels. You can grow things that need a little bit of season extension. You can have some frost protection. You can look at this as a solar energy crop and a traditional crop. Like I mentioned earlier, you can also lease to solar development companies and get revenue that way. There's wind blockage and erosion prevention from the solar panels. And then there's the increased pollinator habitat. It is worth noting that this doesn't work well with tractors. So it works better with crops that you would hand pick or hand harvest or harvest in another way besides tractors. Or you would want to set up your rack system so that they're spaced and you could get the tractors in between them. So site preparation, a lot of these ag lands have been tilled and graded. And so one of the larger costs when you're doing a solar development is this grading and flattening. And there's a lot of ag lands that aren't being used, maybe they're conservation buffers, that are already ready to go for these ground mounted systems. So it really is nice for the solar developments if there's lands like this that aren't being used for more than a buffer. There's a great opportunity to come in and to put some ground mounted systems. So temperature is another consideration where it's mutually beneficial to have co-location. The solar modules can shade and cool the ground and they can give some frost protection for your crops and keep them warmer at night. And then the crops in turn can keep that temperature a little bit lower and decrease the potential for heat damage to your panels. This also helps conserve water. Ranching is another great opportunity for agrivoltaics. For grazing, you can graze sheep, work incredibly well underneath solar panels. The American Solar Grazing Association has really good information on this. We're currently working with a group called Helical Solar, and they're developing a new rack system that works well with cattle, for cattle grazing. So this is a great potential, and oftentimes solar developers will pay farmers or ranchers to bring their livestock there and graze so that they're not having to mow, anything like that with maintenance. Processing, that's another aspect of agriculture that works really well with solar. Anything that's using an electric power can be powered with solar. You can do your fans, your pumps, motors, lighting, electric equipment. There's also opportunities for if you need to do off-grid cooling. So the picture down in the right is a group that we're working with called Ridge to Reefs, and they developed this for an application in Puerto Rico. A lot of the crops there is very hot and humid, and so they need to have cooling right away. And they needed to have something that they couldn't plug in really easily there. So they developed these off-grid cooling systems, and it worked out really well. So they're doing those around the country now. Irrigation is another great opportunity for agri-solar. The solar can power irrigation systems for your crops. They can also power stock watering. They can do the stock water tank heaters in the winter. It's not irrigation, but fencing. Electric fencing is also a great use of solar. And then the picture on the right, if you look, there's the circular pivot irrigation fields. Those areas all around the non-irrigated corners, those are a great opportunity to put some solar development. If there's nothing happening in those lands, that's a great use of those lands. Similarly, conservation lands are an excellent use of agrivoltaics. There's quite a bit of funding available for this too. So I've put the links embedded in this so you can click in and see if your land is appropriate for this. There's conservation buffers, prairie strips and pollinator strips are all available to get funding through NRCS and USDA. And this can fund all the way up to 50%. So it's really worthwhile to look and see if you can apply for this, if you're going to do this with your operation. So in a lot of operations around the country, there's a great need for farm and ranch worker heat relief. One of the leading causes of death of farm and ranch workers is heat stroke. And that's a completely preventable death. So you can use the panels themselves as shade, or you can use a system like the one I've developed on the bottom. And that's like a portable cooling system that I'm hoping that we can develop through NCAT to help farm workers and ranch workers at least cool down a little bit during the day so they can get that heat stroke risk down. A lot of states are bringing in shade laws now. California and Texas have shade laws now. So I think as that happens, there's going to be a greater talk about shade and the necessity for shade in agricultural operations. And solar will, I hope, play a big part of that. So this is a new thing that NCAT is working on. Because we work both in the spaces of sustainable agriculture and sustainable energy, we would like to help the two sectors talk. And we want to become a national information hub for agri-solar information. We want to help solar developers talk to farmers, help consumers talk to technology companies, and really be an information hub for everybody. We want to help develop best practices, do key research, and work with all of our partners. Our partners are there on the right. We've got a great group of folks that's working with us. Argonne National Lab is working with pollinators and what grows well underneath the panels. Center for Rural Affairs is helping us talk to different rural markets and figure out where solar development can work best with agrivoltaics. The Fresh Energy Center for Pollinators is doing great pollinator work all around the country. George Washington University is working on policy for this. Helical Solar is the group that I talked about previously that's working on the racking system for cattle grazing. You all know Montana Renewable Energy Association if you're here right now. The Oak Ridge National Lab is doing research into the best crops that can grow under and around solar panels, and then looking at pollinators. Ridge to Reefs is another group that I talked about earlier, that they're working on sustainable energy and sustainable ag opportunities, particularly in insular communities like Puerto Rico and Hawaii. Sita Sisla is doing research at Cal Poly, and she's looking into what grows best, what type of water is needed, information like that, what grazing works well underneath solar panels. We're also working with the Smithsonian Conservation Biology Institute and their Virginia Working Landscapes to look at solar on their farms there and how it works in their landscapes. And then Wex's technology is developing some really interesting technology to monitor the water and the soil health and then the solar production that occurs in an agrivoltaic operation. And then here's some resources that might be helpful. I know this was a really high level overview of agrivoltaics, so I thought I'd give some links to places you could look. The Solar Grazing Association is a great source of information. NREL has quite a bit of information, particularly the document that's highlighted there. US DOE also has quite a bit of information, and the Inspire project wiki is really interesting. They're consistently doing great projects all around the country, and they update that really frequently. The Desire database is a good place to look if you're looking for funding or tax incentives. We have a couple links for a few more of our partners there, and then links to how to look for funding through USDA for the pollinator strips and the conservation lands. So go ahead and stop sharing here so you can start answering questions or asking questions.
Excellent. Thank you, Stacie. Really appreciate you sharing that with us today. Yeah, so if you have a question, please feel free to start entering it into the chat, and we'll go through and we'll just see what we can get to as time allows. Stacie, I have a quick question while we wait for some of the other ones to come in.
Sure.
I was wondering, you know, as you move these ideas forward, what are some of the goals with what are some of the goals with sharing this opportunity with some of the actual farmers and ranchers? How do you intend to potentially reach them with this kind of information about the potential on their property?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that's a lot of what we're hoping to do with the clearinghouse is try to find a way to help everybody talk. So right now we have some pretty good connection with farmers and ranchers throughout the country through our ATRA program at NCAT. So I think we'll use that as a mechanism to sort of push that information out. And then I think mentoring is a really good option. So if we can have, we'd like the idea of bringing, you know, operations that are already doing agrivoltaics and partnering them with people that might be interested in doing it so that they can learn from each other, and then maybe do some podcasts, do some videos, information like that, that would then be available for future people that might want to watch and understand, you know, here's what worked best on their lands, here's where they looked for funding, here's a type of ownership model that worked for them, here's how community solar worked for this farm community, something like that.
Okay, yeah, a lot of different ways of trying to share that information.
Yeah.
It looks like we do have a couple questions here. So let me just go through and begin. One question is referring to, you know, kind of farmer mentality around bringing solar onto their farms. If there is any knowledge on your end of, like, are farmers interested in that, and also are there challenges? Second part of the question is, are there challenges with being far from the grid? How close to a grid do you have to be for that to be a lucrative option?
Sure. I mean, I think that would depend on what type of system you want. You know, if you want to be grid tied. So, you know, if you did want to be grid tied, of course, you'd want to be pretty close. If you wanted your own battery system, it wouldn't really matter. A lot of farmers use it for things like stock tank watering, you know, to keep it not freeze in the winter, to power their fencing, things like that. And those are great when you're nowhere near the grid, and you don't want to draw a line out there and pay for it. So I do see that. Those aren't large operations. I think a lot of farmers, you know, they're probably concerned about the cost of putting in a system, and that's where leasing makes some sense, or community solar might make some sense. We are seeing more movement in it across the country, of farmers being interested in this idea, but I do think that there's a pushback of some of the not in my backyard folks that they just don't want to see the lands taken. And I think as long as there's an assurance that it'll still be agricultural land and it's not just a decimated solar farm, I think there'll be a lot of acceptance there. And I think as long as there can be funding and incentives to help folks pay for the development, that will help promote it too.
Mm-hmm. And I should have mentioned that was Marta's. That was Marta's question. Thank you,
Okay.
Marta. We have another question here. Let's see if I can scroll through these. So another question is about solar collection to power storage, especially for irrigation corners. So kind of the idea, I'm sorry, Robin, this is your question. I'm a little bit uncertain what you're asking about, but I suppose the idea is how do you use solar to power by collecting it in those irrigation corners that I think, Stacie, you were saying were not being irrigated.
Oh, sure. I mean, I think that would also, it would again depend on if you have a grid tied system or not, because you could use the grid as your battery if it was a grid tied system. Or, you know, you would have to be sized for what your pump is, what your irrigation pump is. We have worked on that at NCAT for some solar powered irrigation pumps and on pivot systems that do that. It's not the cheapest option, definitely, but it is something that some people, particularly when they are a long way from a grid tie, they are doing that.
I have another question here from Mary. Is there anything equivalent to mineral royalties for solar for landowners who lease their land?
I know that there's leasing that occurs that, yeah, there are farmers that lease portions of their land, particularly like their conservation or their buffer lands, to solar development. I don't know that there's like a mineral right that occurs with it, anything like that. I don't think there's like surface rights like a mineral right is.
Mm-hmm. Another question that's coming up from Carly is, are you seeing agrovoltaics more on a corporate level or on a local level? Like, could you talk about maybe the funding grants for individual ranchers?
Sure. I am seeing it on a corporate level. You know, there's groups like Cliff Bar that are doing some really cool work. And I think that those folks just really want to show a corporate commitment to things like agrivoltaics and agri-solar and solar in general. And so that this is another way to do that. We're more interested at NCAT. We're a little more interested in what the actual farmers are doing. So I do see more of it on that level. And then we do see community solar being a part of that, which isn't necessarily corporate or individual farmer, but it's a model for more farmers to get together, pool money, and be able to afford a solar system.
Mm-hmm. Another question is kind of interesting along the lines of multi-purpose for these lands. Is there any way that solar systems can be used as water catchment devices for these agricultural lands?
I mean, they haven't. It would depend on the tilt and what you're using to catch it, but I don't see why you couldn't do that. I don't know why not. I don't know that I've seen that, but I think that's a great idea.
Okay, yeah. And then I'm scrolling through, see if there's ones I missed here. Thank you all for submitting so many questions. I really appreciate it. Let's see. Someone was asking about community solar here in Montana. So that's Rob and Lori. So their kind of assumption would be that these kinds of installations would have to be very personal, since there aren't necessarily things like enabling community solar. I think Rob and Lori, you're probably talking about our current net metering system that kind of precludes like virtual net metering. So yeah, Stacie, what do you think about these developments, and if there are potential for them to be community solar, or if they're going to be more personal operations on people's farms?
I think there'll be both. I think there'll be a mix, and I think it will depend on scale and size. I mean, I think personally, an operation's probably gonna, if they're just gonna have their own farm or their own ranch, it's not gonna be a large scale development, but if you want a larger scale development, it would be more, I think it'd be more affordable for folks to do a community solar, but I think there's a huge potential for community solar. Particularly in like a farming community, if you have a lot of ag lands with an area that they could all access for solar. But I think there's funding for individual nationally and for community. So I don't think one precludes the other. I think both can happen, and I think there's a huge potential for both.
Okay, yeah. No, it looks like we may have gotten to everybody's question thus far. If anybody has one more question, feel free to put it in there. I'll give a moment here, see if anything percolates up.
Well, thanks everybody.
Yeah, and so that looks like we've covered all of our questions thus far. So thank you all so much for coming today. This is the summer series, and we will be continuing next week for our final summer series. It will be focusing on a special guest speaker from the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, so please tune in then. We hope you will have a great week until then, and thank you again. Thank you again, Stacie, for sharing this information with us.